Johan, can you maybe clarify what is the term attorney's fees to us?
Amoré, I think there's a bit of a misconception, when a transferring attorney basically provides an account to a purchaser. It seems to be enormous, and it's normally a conglomerate of costs which the attorney not necessarily uses or basically debits as a fee, but it involves a lot of expenses that the transferring attorney or the relevant attorney doing the bond or the cancellation is collecting on behalf of some institution or some specific state organization. Just to give you an indication, a small portion of the account delivered to the relevant client would obviously constitute the fee that we debit for purposes of our services rendered. But I think if a purchaser scrutinizes the account thoroughly and has a look at it, he will notice that that fee is the smaller part of the account. The biggest part of the account is obviously the transfer duties, which entails the tax that needs to be paid on each and every transaction. And many, if not most, of the purchasers know how the sliding scale for purposes of that tax works. And that is normally the biggest chunk of change of the transferring account. Further specific costs included will be the deeds office registration fees, VAT on the fee portion, expenses like posts and petties, normally a so-called instruction generation fee, which is payable to our service providers like LexPro and those specific people who provide the software for purposes of generation of the instruction. And then to get back to your physical question with regards to the involvement of a lot of attorneys in this specific instance, one has to remember that the transfer of the property, which is primarily the transfer from one person to the other, will be dealt with by one attorney called the transferring attorney. Then if the seller has existing mortgage bonds over the property, there will be a cancellation of those mortgage bonds, and that will be attended to by a cancellation attorney appointed by the relevant bank of the seller. And last but not least, if there's a mortgage bond that needs to be registered on behalf of the purchaser who acquires the property, then the bond attorney will attend to that specific registration, who's again appointed by the purchaser's bank. It can be so if you serve on all the panels, then you can be the same attorney attending to the transfer, the cancellation, and the mortgage bond. But it can also be split between three different attorneys who then link with one another and simultaneously lodge in the deeds office.
Yes, this sounds like a very difficult process, but it's not such a difficult process if three people work together to the same goal. We do this every day. And we sometimes do it where a client sells their property and also where they buy another property. So then you can work with 6 attorneys. It's sometimes then better to have the same attorney that's doing the transfer of the one property to also do the transfer of the next property, because this helps in the process, especially with communication, and to get the papers signed by everyone on a quicker basis than normal.
Most definitely, Amoré, we've been canvassing in the past for purposes of keeping the bond with the transferring attorney the same as the bond attorney, as it will improve the turnaround times on the whole transaction. You can imagine that if there's not a distance or communication gap between the transferring attorney and the bond attorney, not that I'm saying that it will be inevitable, but if there is more people involved in the specific process, it would obviously cause more communication and a possible lack of communication in certain instances, which can affect the turnaround times. So our firm, for example, does serve on all the major banks panels. So the whole idea is when we get appointed by the seller to do the transfer, that we at least attend to the registration of the mortgage bond in favor of the purchaser and the bank as well, so that we keep everything under one umbrella and obviously limit the communication and possible lack of translation somewhere, someplace in the process.
Yes, so in summary, what you would say is attorney's fee, that's a loose term thrown around by everyone, doesn't necessarily mean this is the attorney's fees, and if they want to give you any discount on that, that will then mean that it's the total price. The attorney's fee is a small part of it. And the most of the fees that you're going to pay is actually fees towards different companies or different institutions. And this is not to the attorney itself. And then the second thing, what I would also say is that it's better if you're going to buy a property and sell your property. With the selling part, you've got the right as the seller to choose who the attorney is. So to make it easier on yourself, make sure where you sell your property first, if that is the case, that you appoint one attorney and then request from the next place that you're going to buy from that seller, who also has the major choice in who the attorneys are going to be, is ask them if the same attorney can then also be the attorney that's doing your buying part, because this will help with the process and the turnaround time.
Undoubtedly, it definitely aids the process. And like you say, where we have different transactions where the seller, for example, sells his property and then acquires another property, we can link the two transactions together to register simultaneously. And most of the parties prefer that, obviously, out of an occupational rent and occupational perspective. They don't want to pay occupational rent where they sell or where they buy. So they would like to sync those two transactions so that they can register simultaneously in the deeds office. And to enable the attorneys to streamline that, it's much better to have it under one roof so that you obviously can streamline the whole process. And if there's any hiccup with regards to one of the transactions, you'll be the first to know. And obviously you can iron those problems out to synchronize the transactions and register them simultaneously.
Yes, and I think the thing that buyers and sellers are unaware of is the fact that there is so many parties involved in buying and selling a property. If you can make that part where communication is going to be dealt with all parties, it's easier to minimize the people that's working on the transaction, and we can merge the transactions easier then.
Definitely, I think it's a general concept in any type of business. The least people involved in a specific process, the chances are much slimmer than something can go wrong or something gets lost in translation. So if we can limit the participants in a specific transaction, that would obviously be preferable. And you provide the same service in that regard. So the turnaround times is imminent, and it's of the utmost importance for all parties concerned. Time is money, and therefore we need to do it as soon as possible. And the fewer people working on the transaction, the better.
Good. Thank you, Johan, for your time.
Only a pleasure.